Good evening, everybody. Appreciate you joining us tonight. Um, John, I'm very frustrated because you put that poll up, and maybe it was because I'm a panelist or something, but I couldn't vote. I tried to click the button, but it wouldn't work. But I've definitely had had breakdowns, so more than a few. So you could add one to the tally for me if you would. As John said, the subject tonight is we're going to be talking about dealing with aircraft breakdowns while you're away from home, and specifically the three rules that we have developed for doing this. Um, you know, I'm probably best known these days for being a mechanic, but the fact is I've been an aircraft owner a whole lot longer than I've been a mechanic, and that's part of why I have sort of a different take on maintenance than most of the mechanics you've talked to. I've actually been a pilot for 50 years. I bought my first aircraft 48 years ago, and I fly lots of long trips in the airplane, including at least one or two transcontinental trips a year and lots of shorter cross countries. Aviation is a very rich endeavor, and there's lots of things. Some people like aerobatics, some people like air racing, some people like $100 hamburgers. Personally, I think that taking long cross countries is one of the most rewarding things that general aviation has to offer, and even after 50 years, I simply never get tired of being able to see the expanse of this country and even beyond this country from the perspective of a general aviation airplane, which is like no other way to see the country. And over the time that I've been doing this, it has been getting easier and easier to use general aviation for serious cross-country flying. Having real-time weather in the cockpit was a major game changer for me. Having iPads and ForeFlight, self-serve fuel every place, Uber when you land, because it used to be that ground transportation was always a problem at small airports. It's just a great experience, except when something goes wrong with the airplane while you're away from home, and that tends to be an aircraft owner's worst nightmare because you're typically stuck somewhere you really don't want to be. You're dependent on strangers to help you out. It's a very, very uncomfortable feeling to be away from home and have a broken airplane. And for a long time, I thought that why don't we have a solution for this in general aviation? Why isn't there the equivalent of a AAA for airplanes? Well, I wound up starting Savvy about 8 years ago, and we're the largest firm in the world specializing in the management and maintenance for owner-flown general aviation aircraft, and 95% of the aircraft that we manage are piston-powered. We manage the maintenance of more than 700 piston GA aircraft now, and over the 8 years, analyzing our database, we found that our typical client, managed maintenance client, has some sort of a breakdown on the road about once every 2 years on average. So we deal with more than 350 AOGs per year. I'll be using the term AOG from time to time as we talk tonight. It's maintenance speak. It stands for aircraft on ground, and it basically means an airplane that's stuck somewhere and not flyable. So if I say AOG, it's kind of a synonym for the term breakdown. So in any case, about 2 years ago, I started talking to John about this, and saying, we really ought to be able to put together something that's the equivalent of AAA for airplanes, so that when people have airplane problems on the road, they have a toll-free number to call, and they have help available whenever they need it. And of course, these breakdowns typically always seem to happen at the worst possible times, on nights and weekends and holidays and stuff like that. And so we formed a little partnership with Sporty's and created something called the Sporty's Breakdown Assistance Program. And it's a very inexpensive program designed to cover you for breakdowns when you're more than 50 miles away from home base. In other words, far enough away that you can't rely on your regular shop or mechanic to help you out. We provide a 24/7 toll-free hotline. From the time you call, we almost always will get back to you with an experienced ANPIA who knows the systems in your aircraft within 15 minutes of the time you call, day or night, weekends, holidays. And the cost of the program is about $150 a year for a piston single. It took us about a year working with Sporty's to put this thing together. It was kind of complicated, a lot of moving parts to make this happen. We wound up having to interface a bunch of computers with one another and develop APIs so that they could talk with one another, because people sign up through Sporty's. Sporty's computer has to tell our computer who's signed up for the program and the details about their airplanes and that sort of thing. We have a 24/7 call center that's in Columbus, Ohio, and their computer has to interface with our computer so that when you call the hotline, the person at the call center takes down your information and it automatically goes into our computer. And then our computer has to figure out which mechanics are on call at that particular time of day by interfacing with a Google Calendar, and then they wind up sending text messages and robocalls and stuff to get the mechanic in touch with you. And it all has worked really smoothly, and we typically have been getting back within 5 or 10 minutes of the time that somebody calls the hotline. So it's been an interesting experience. But let me talk to you about how we handle breakdowns when we do get these calls. We have a philosophy that we call owner first, airplane second, and it's kind of unique, and I'm going to illustrate to you what this means. But basically, when an aircraft owner calls us stuck somewhere with a broken airplane, our mindset is that our job is not to fix the airplane, it's to resolve the owner's predicament. Sometimes fixing the airplane is the best way to resolve the owner's predicament, but frequently fixing the airplane is exactly the wrong thing to do. And that seems a little counterintuitive, but I'm going to give you some specific examples so you can see what I mean. We've developed 3 rules that we use to guide the way we handle breakdowns, and these 3 rules have been developed, I guess I would say, through the School of Hard Knocks. We've handled lots of problems, dealt with lots of maintenance facilities, had pretty much everything that can go wrong, and as a result of that, have learned a lot about the best way to handle these things. So let me briefly review the rules with you, and then I'll give you some real-life examples of how they actually put into play. The first rule is do not put your airplane in a shop until you know what's wrong with it, or until you have gone as far as you can in diagnosing the problem. When aircraft owners have an airplane problem, their first knee-jerk reaction is usually to find a mechanic and put their airplane in his maintenance hangar. And if you do that, the chances are about 100 to 1 that the first thing the mechanic's going to do is start attacking the airplane with tools. We really don't want him to do that until we have a really good idea of what's wrong, because it may not be necessary to take your airplane apart, and it often isn't. And so, when we deal with breakdowns, our first goal is to gather data and do a diagnosis, not to try to fix the airplane, but to try to assess what's wrong with the airplane. Rule number 2 is don't perform maintenance away from home if you can possibly avoid it. If we can diagnose a problem and determine that the airplane is safe to fly home, then flying it home and dealing with the problem when you get home is almost always the best course of action. Or if you can't fly home, at least fly it to a convenient location to have the work done, where you have a shop that you know and trust and who has expertise with your airplane. And in dealing with literally thousands of these breakdown episodes over the years, what we found is that about half the time, probably a little more than half the time, we're able to review the symptoms and the data, come up with a diagnosis, and tell the aircraft owner, this is not a safety of flight issue, it's okay to fly home, we'll deal with it when you get back. Or it's okay to continue your trip and deal with it at a more convenient place and a more convenient time. So we try really hard not to do maintenance away from home if we can possibly avoid it, and a surprising amount of time we can. And the third and final rule is, if maintenance away from home is unavoidable, if we do have a safety of flight issue, then we want to do the absolute minimum necessary to get the airplane in a condition where it can fly home safely, and do the rest of it when the airplane gets home. So we may want to do a temporary fix, something quick and dirty, get the airplane flyable, fly it home, and have the maintenance done at home. We really try hard not to do maintenance on the road if you can possibly avoid it. So the rules are simple, but the application sometimes is not real straightforward. So let me relate a few real-life war stories of some breakdowns that we've dealt with in recent times that kind of illustrate why these rules are so important. And I'll start off talking about a fellow by the name of Gary Troop, who lives in Destin, Florida, has a 2009 Cirrus SR-22 turbo-normalized airplane. Gary found himself stuck in Tallahassee, Florida. He was about to launch for home back at Destin, and his hope was to get home in time for dinner. And he got in the airplane in Tallahassee to fly home to Destin and discovered he couldn't get the engine to start. He called us. He described the symptoms. He said when he turned the key that he could hear the starter making noise, but the prop just twitched and it wouldn't really turn and the engine couldn't start. From his description, the diagnosis was immediately obvious. It's a classic symptom of a slipping starter drive adapter in a Continental engine. And that's a fairly common failure mode, and it has exactly the symptoms that Gary described. So when we explained to him what was wrong, his first reaction was what most owners would. Well, I guess I need to put the airplane in the shop here. And as it happens, there was a Cirrus authorized service center on the field at Tallahassee. And so Gary said, well, I'll call the Cirrus service center, have them tow the aircraft into their shop and replace the starter drive adapter. And that's the reaction that I think most owners in Gary's position would have. Our reaction was immediately to ask Gary, please not to do that. because we knew that would not result in a good outcome for him. For one thing, we knew that Continental starter drive adapters were 10 days back ordered, and so he wouldn't be able to, the shop would not be able to get him one for a minimum of 10 days. And it's also a 4-hour labor job to remove the old starter adapter and install a new one. And so, you know, basically, if Gary took his airplane and put it in the shop in Tallahassee, that airplane was going to be stuck there for about 2 weeks. And we didn't think Gary was going to be very happy being stuck in Tallahassee. So what we did was advised him, instead of putting the airplane in the shop, to call the local FBO and ask them to bring over their ground power unit and plug it into his airplane and give him a 28-volt ground power unit start. Because we know from experience, when Continental starter drive adapters start to slip during normal 24-volt starts, they are almost always good for at least a few more starts if you power the airplane from a 28-volt ground power unit. So we figured he had a real good chance of getting the airplane started that way. He'd be able to fly it home, have dinner at home, have the work done at his home shop. Much better outcome for Gary. And so that's what we advised him to do. The next thing that happened was he called back about 20 minutes later. From his cell phone, you could hear the engine running in the background, and said that the engine started just fine on 28 volts and that he was about to launch for home. We then proceeded to call the director of maintenance at Gary's regular shop in Destin, explained his situation, asked them to order a replacement starter drive adapter so that it would they'd have it to put it in his airplane, and Gary made it home for dinner. So this is a textbook case of what I meant when I said that our philosophy is owner first, airplane second. Instead of focusing on fixing the airplane, we focused on solving Gary's problem, which was to get himself and the airplane home. And the result was a much better outcome. If he'd put it in the shop, he'd probably had to arrange for alternate transportation home, and then a couple weeks later he'd have to arrange for transportation back to Tallahassee so he could get his airplane. And the work was going to be done at a strange shop instead of the shop that he was used to, and so on. So it was just a better way to do it. Now sometimes it's not quite that simple. Sometimes we really do have to do maintenance on the airplane to make it flyable. And to illustrate that point, I'll talk about another breakdown situation we had. This one was an aircraft owner by the name of Mike Busch, lives in the Bay Area, has a beautiful 1980 Cessna 195. As it happened, Mark and his wife flew in the airplane to Minden, Nevada, where his wife's mom lives. His wife's mom was sick, and they flew out there to spend some time taking care of her. And when the mom was on the mend, they went out to the airport to fly home. But when Mark went to start his Cessna 185, he discovered that there was no oil pressure, which is not exactly what you would like to see in a situation like that. So he asked around to find out whether there was an A&P who could come look at his airplane on a Saturday. And it turns out that there was one A&P on the field that lived nearby. So Mark called him, and the guy came out and opened up his hangar, and they pulled Mark airplanes in. The A&P hooked an external pressure gauge to the engine, started it briefly, and verified that indeed there really was no oil pressure. It wasn't just a problem with his gauge. The mechanic removed the oil filter, cut it open, told Mark that the oil filter was full of bearing metal and that the engine was going to need a teardown. Mechanic goes back into his office for a few minutes and emerges with a written estimate covering engine removal, teardown, and reinstallation totaling more than $10,000. Mark was not a happy camper. He decided to give us a call at this point because he wanted some help and wanted a second opinion. So I asked Mark if he could take an iPhone photo of the metal that the A&P mechanic found in the oil filter so I could get some idea of the magnitude of the disaster. And a few minutes later, Mark sent a couple of photos of the oil filter media, which I studied quite closely. And there were, as you can see, there were a few little flecks of metal in the filter, but nothing particularly alarming. And I just couldn't imagine that somebody would look at those few flecks of metal in the oil filter and suddenly condemn the engine to death. That seemed like a completely unreasonable response. I asked Mark a couple of questions to try to eliminate some of the obvious things. I said, did you check the oil on the dipstick? Is there enough oil in the engine? He said, yeah, there's plenty of oil in the engine, but they couldn't get any oil pressure. Well, under those circumstances, the most likely reason for no oil pressure would be a contaminated oil pressure relief valve, something that sits on the back of the engine, on the back of the oil pump, and regulates oil pressure. It's a little spring-loaded plunger that acts as an oil pressure regulator, and if some foreign material gets stuck in it and holds the plunger open, you won't get oil pressure when you start the engine. So I suggested that Mark have the mechanic remove the relief valve housing and inspect to see if there's any contamination in there. It seemed like a much more reasonable first step than just immediately deciding that the engine has to be removed and torn down. About a half an hour later, Mark sends me a little photograph and says, sure enough, we opened the pressure relief valve and we found this little speck of metal, about the size of smaller than a broken pencil point, stuck in the oil pressure relief valve. I asked him to check that piece of metal with a magnet and see whether it was ferrous or non-ferrous, and he said it was not magnetic. Looking at the photo, and he verified this, the metal was silvery in color, not coppery in color, so I was quite certain that it was a little chunk of aluminum, that it wasn't bearing material. And I said to Mark, you know, I'm not really concerned about this little piece of aluminum being stuck in the oil pressure relief valve unless there's a whole bunch more little pieces of aluminum floating around in the oil pan. And so we really need to check that. However, turns out the A&P was just, he was getting belligerent. He was not interested in going any further with diagnostic procedures. He still insisted that the engine needed to be torn down, and getting kind of confrontational, and Mark was starting to freak out, and he's worried that this mechanic's going to ground his airplane and hold it hostage and stuff. So I told him not to panic. We had a little further conversation, and it turns out that Mark's kind of handy with tools and does his own oil changes and carries a pretty good emergency toolkit in the airplane when he flies. And since this mechanic was starting to use strong-arm tactics on him, I suggested that Mark direct the A&P to put the airplane back together, give him a logbook entry for the work he performed, pay his bill, and get his airplane out of there before the A&P started dismantling the airplane any further. The mechanic was not happy about this, gave Mark kind of a nasty, gratuitous-looking logbook entry that talked about all of the stuff he found in the filter. Mechanics are not supposed to do that. logbook entries are supposed to describe the work performed. They're not supposed to describe what's wrong with the airplane. But this mechanic couldn't resist making editorial comments, and I told Mark, don't get into a fight with him. Just accept the logbook entry and get your airplane out of there. So he did. He also, the mechanic insisted on being paid with a cashier's check before he would release the aircraft to Mark, but eventually they got that sorted out and he got the airplane out of jail. So I then started to work with him to see if this airplane was safe to fly home. First of all, I asked him to run up the engine and see if it was making oil pressure now that they took that little piece of aluminum out of the relief valve, and Mark sent me a picture of the oil pressure gauge, said, yeah, it was making oil pressure just fine. I was still worried that there might be more aluminum floating around in the engine, so I asked him whether he could figure out some way to drain the oil through some window screen or cheesecloth or something to see whether there was metal in it. He did that, sent me a picture of some cheesecloth in a bucket that just had a lot of oil in it, but no metal. So that was good. I had Mark do a 30-minute ground run, had him do a full power high-speed taxi down the long runway at the airport. All the signs were good, and so ultimately, without belaboring this, we decided between the two of us that we thought this airplane was safe to fly home, which was really the objective. And it was late in the day, so they checked into a hotel, and the next morning they flew back home to the Bay Area. The engine performed just fine. Oil pressure was rock steady all the way. Not long after he got home, the airplane went into a very good shop for an annual inspection, and we found out where that chunk of aluminum came from. It turned out that the oil filter adapter had been loose and vibrating, and it was making some metal from the threads, and it was something that was relatively easy to repair, did not require removing or tearing down the engine. And it would have really been a crime if that had been the outcome. But again, my objective was to, in this case, to do the minimum maintenance possible to get the airplane back home, and that's what we did. It turned out to be a much better outcome for Mark than the alternative would have been. The last war story I'll tell you is one that happened quite recently, and it was kind of a fun one. It involved a fellow from Nigeria with an unpronounceable name, but everybody calls him Lola, and Lola had decided that he was going to become the first African to fly solo around the world, and he was going to do this in a 2004 Cirrus SR-22. Got a whole bunch of sponsors, started off on this mission. The airplane left from, I guess they started off in Washington, D.C. To on a round the world solo flight. This is a Cirrus SR-22. It's an all-electric airplane with kind of wall-to-wall glass. It's in an Avidyne glass cockpit. At any rate, he left Washington, flew up to Canada, and then on the leg from Gooseberry, Labrador to Reykjavik, Iceland, the airplane developed an electrical system problem. And that's particularly serious in a Cirrus because it's an all-electric airplane, and you cannot afford to lose the electrics in a Cirrus. And basically what happened was that during this leg, he suddenly got an alarm and noted and saw that the voltage reading on the E-bus, the emergency bus, was about 13 volts. It's supposed to be 28 volts. The main bus voltage was correct, but the emergency bus voltage was about half of what it's supposed to be, or less than half what it was supposed to be, and he was quite concerned about that, understandably. The So he lands at Reykjavik, takes it into the shop at Reykjavik. None of the mechanics at Reykjavik had any experience with the Cirrus electrical system, which is a pretty complicated multi-bus system with 2 batteries and 2 alternators and 5 or 6 different buses and stuff like that. The mechanics there performed some rudimentary checks and concluded that both of the alternators were functioning properly. They did not have, they could not figure out why he was getting this low voltage reading on the emergency bus, but the electrical system in the Cirrus is controlled by a complicated and expensive box called an MCU, Master Control Unit, and they recommended that he order a replacement Master Control Unit from Cirrus, which would have cost him about $3,000 and would have taken a week to get there and get installed while he was trying to do his around the world trip. So since he didn't really have any confidence that these mechanics knew what they were doing, and they admitted to him they really didn't, they didn't have any experience with the Cirruses or the Cirrus electrical system. So he contacted us. As soon as I found out it was an electrical problem, I assigned it to Jeff Eskirka, who's my technical director. It also happens to be one of the most expert people I know on the Cirrus electrical system, which is a pretty complicated system. Jeff had Lola download his engine monitor data, took a look at it, and concluded that, in fact, the E-bus voltage was not 13 volts, that it was what it was supposed to be, but that the readout was faulty. The glass panel readout was lying, and it was because of a fault in a box called the sensor interface unit, or SIU. So Jeff explained to Lola what was going on, that he really did not have an electrical system problem. He had an indication problem, and that to fix that indication problem was going to require replacing the sensor interface unit. And something Lola, who's a very experienced pilot, airline pilot and so on, asked the exact correct question of Jeff. He said, well, what's the worst that could happen if I continue on to the UK in this condition? Because the UK was going to be the next place where he could find a Cirrus service center that could replace his SIU. And Jeff told Lola that if the SIU got sicker, he could start losing other indications, or maybe all of the indications on his MFD engine page, but that the airplane would still be safe to fly, and it has backup steam gauges for all the critical things. And after having that conversation, Lola made the decision that he would continue on to the UK and take the plane to the Cirrus Service Center near London when he got there to have the SIU replaced. So he launches for England, and guess what happened while he was flying over the North Atlantic? Exactly the scenario that Jeff had described. The SIU went Tango uniform, and basically all of the indications on his engine page went blank. And he took this nice picture and sent it to us after he landed. When he got to the UK, Lola emailed Jeff a thank you note, and one of the things he said in the thank you note, he said, because you warned me that this could happen, I was ready for it. I didn't panic, and I just pretended I was flying my old steam gauge equipped Cessna, which I thought was just great. In any case, the service center in the UK replaced the SIU, and Lola continued his round the world flight successfully. So I thought that was kind of a nice story. At any rate, let's just quickly review, in light of all of that stuff, the 3 rules. Don't put your airplane in the shop until you've diagnosed the problem. And we find that it's amazing how often, in the vast majority of the cases, a problem can be diagnosed remotely simply by through a combination of asking about the symptoms, sometimes downloading engine monitor data, but we normally can diagnose problems, almost always can diagnose problems without taking anything apart. And that's what we want to do. We don't want to attack an airplane with tools until we've gathered all the data that we can gather and figured out what's wrong with the airplane. Rule 2 is don't perform maintenance away from home base if you can possibly avoid it. We always want to try to fly the airplane home or to a more convenient place to have maintenance, like in Lola's case, to get it to the Surrey Service Center in England. And Rule 3, if maintenance away from home is unavoidable, like it was in the case of Mark's 185, then do the absolute minimum necessary to fly home. We needed to get the little piece of aluminum out of the pressure relief valve. We did not need to tear down the engine. So we want to just do the minimum necessary to make the airplane safe to fly home, and then deal with the rest of it after you get home. So John, that's really all the prepared material I have. I hope that was instructive, and why don't we open it up for Q&A.
Great, Mike. Thanks for that, and appreciate the examples there that really put some real-world experience behind it. We do have a number of questions, and folks, we've got plenty of time left to ask some, so keep asking them in that control panel there. Start off with one, Mike, that I know you write about a lot, so I'm sure you have an opinion on. What do you do if you're in one of these situations where the mechanic won't release your airplane? You alluded to that a little bit with the 185 scenario, but what are your rights as an owner, and what are the responsibilities for an A&P or an IA? If he just flat out thinks you're an idiot and you're unsafe, what are your rights as an owner with your airplane in a shop?
Well, sometimes things get difficult, and the case with the 185 was one case where things got really testy between the owner and the mechanic. But I mean, the shorter answer is no mechanic has the right to ground your airplane. If the airplane is going into the shop for an annual inspection, then the mechanic has the right to make a determination, not only right, the obligation to make a determination whether the airplane is airworthy or not. But if you're taking the airplane into a shop to fix something, and it's not in the context of an annual inspection, then you're not asking for an airworthiness determination. The mechanic is not obligated to make an airworthiness determination, and in fact, his opinion of the airworthiness of the airplane is really irrelevant to anything. I've written about this, and I think an instructive analogy is that the situation with airworthiness of an airplane is very much like the way pilot aviation medical condition is assessed. Once every year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, we're required to go to an aviation medical examiner. I know that changes in May, but humor me, and get a professional determination as to whether we're fit to fly. Every other day of the year, it's up to us to self-certify that we're fit to fly. That's exactly the way it works with airplanes. Once a year, we are required to hire an IA to make a formal professional airworthiness determination of the aircraft. In any other, 364 days out of the year, the determination as to whether the airplane is safe to fly lies with the pilot in command, not with the mechanic. And an example that I use a lot when I'm teaching IA renewal seminars, because a lot of mechanics don't really get this, is I tell a mechanic, imagine somebody brings a Cessna 182 into you, and there's two things obviously wrong with it. One is the right main tire is flat, and the other is that the left wing is missing. And the pilot asks you to replace the flat tire. Can you do that and sign off the airplane? And the answer is absolutely yes. you do what the owner asks you to do. Your logbook entry describes the work you did, which was to replace the right main tire. Your signature in the logbook simply denotes that the work that you did and described in the logbook entry was done satisfactorily. It does not say anything about whether the airplane is airworthy. Now, the mechanic certainly could say to the owner, by the way, while I was working on your right main tire, I could not help but notice that the left wing was missing, and just let me give you some friendly advice. If I were you, I would not try to fly the airplane until that wing was reinstalled. But the mechanic can't ground the airplane because it's got the missing wing. The airworthiness of the airplane is not the mechanic's affair. It's the pilot in command who makes the decision whether that airplane is safe to fly, except in the context of an annual inspection, which is the one time that you are asking a mechanic to make an airworthiness determination. So,
great. Yeah, great insight.
So mechanics, other than when you are doing an annual, a mechanic cannot ground your airplane. He can, and they often do, use all sorts of intimidation tactics on owners, but they have no right to ground the airplane, and their determination about airworthiness is really not relevant and has no regulatory significance.
Related to that, Mike, we've had a number of questions here about, how do you, there's some horror stories here, how do you find the right shop? So that's obviously something that is part of this program. So maybe you could talk real briefly about, if you have a breakdown and you call up, how do you make sure you don't get stuck in one of these shops that may be less than reputable?
Well, one of the nice things about this breakdown assistance program is that we deal with hundreds and hundreds of shops. We have an extensive database of maintenance resources all over the country and actually out of the country as well. We record our experiences with the shops. We've got a neat little proprietary Google Map application where we can, if somebody calls stuck in a certain place, we can pull up all the shops within 100 or 200 mile radius of where the airplane's stuck, and they show up with nice little color-coded icons. Green if we've had good experiences with the shop, red if we've had terrible experiences, yellow if they've been sort of mediocre. But the other thing is, it's really important to, sometimes you just have to use whoever is available, but the key is to keep them on a very tight leash. The mechanic is the the hands and the toolbox, but you don't want to relinquish the decision making to the mechanic. The decision making is something that the owner is supposed to do. The mechanic is supposed to carry out the owner's wishes, and sometimes it's hard for owners to take the appropriately assertive stance in dealing with maintenance people to get them to do what they want and to get them not to do what they don't want done. That's when it can be very helpful to have somebody like us where we're talking to the guy mechanic to mechanic, and we know exactly how to deal with these guys. I have, you talk about that guy in Minden who wanted to tear down the engine. If you put yourself in that mechanic's position, here is some itinerant pilot who he's never seen before, who he'll probably never see again. He doesn't know whether the guy is a litigious, nasty person, or whether he's a nice guy or anything. And when a mechanic's in a situation like this, all he sees is liability. And so mechanics will tend to be overly conservative in their recommendations because they want to minimize their liability exposure, or what they perceive to be the liability exposure. And this mechanic knows, if he does something to the engine, puts it back together, and then something bad happens, it's going to be on him. But if he transfers the liability to an overhaul shop and says, now we got to pull this engine, send it off somewhere, then he's off the hook. He's not liable anymore. Somebody else is liable. And so, a lot of mechanic decision making is done out of fear of liability, and one has to be, fairly assertive to prevent being victimized by that sort of thing. That what happened in Minden was not all that unusual in my experience, and it's kind of the knee-jerk reaction that you'll often find when mechanics are dealing with pilots that they don't have a relationship with.
Along those lines, Mike, we've had a couple questions from folks who are saying, what is that shop's liability in the example of, he recommends that you fix something and you say no and blast off. What's that shop's liability if they have recommended service and you say no, and then heaven forbid something happens? Are they going to be on the hook for that?
Well, I think that let's give that A&P and Minden the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that his concerns were well taken. Let's say he had real concerns that engine might come apart. There's a right way and a wrong way to deal with that, and the right way for a mechanic to deal with that is to give the owner advice and then write that advice down on a piece of paper, sign it, ask the owner to co-sign it, and keep a copy. That way, if the owner flies home and the airplane crashes and somebody tries to blame the mechanic has his get out of jail free card. He's got a signed document that proves that he advised the owner not to fly the airplane, with a counter signature that the owner indeed received that advice, and the mechanic is off the hook. Mechanic can't. The decision whether to fly the airplane or not is not the mechanic's decision. It's the owner's decision. The mechanic has an obligation to give the owner his best advice, but he doesn't have the authority to enforce that advice. And that's where the tricky part comes in. So this mechanic in Minden could have handled things in a much better way than he did. And the owner probably could have handled things in a better way than he did. I got into the middle of about halfway through and felt like it needed to be de-escalated. But it's not an unusual situation for owners and mechanics to wind up in a confrontational situation.
And that's I think a great point we're stressing there, Mike, is if something does happen, and certainly if you're a breakdown assistance member, you want to call Savvy right away. You don't want to wait until this thing goes off the rails and the airplane is taken apart and then try to save it. The answer is to get involved from the very beginning, right?
Absolutely, and one of the most important reasons for that, John, is that the minute the mechanic attacks the airplane with tools, he typically eliminates the ability to gather data because the airplane is non-functional, and so we can't ask the pilot to run up the engine and try different things and tell us what he sees and so on, because the airplane's in pieces. And so we don't want the airplane to be in pieces, both because that precludes us gathering the information we need to do a diagnosis, and also because, as I said, at least 50% of the time, it turns out that there's no reason to take the airplane apart. We diagnose the problem, we say it's okay to fly to England that way, and deal with it there. So we don't want to take the airplane apart unless we've determined that it really needs to be taken apart in order to be safe to fly.
Mike, we've had, switching topics just a little bit here, we've had a number of questions that relate to sort of the program itself and what is covered. In particular, 3 or 4 questions on experimental aircraft. Can you talk maybe just briefly about sort of what airplanes are covered, any sort of fine print or things like that?
Yeah, John, you and I have had this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way we have things written up right now, the program only covers certificated airplanes. We're okay with providing breakdown assistance service to experimental airplanes to the extent that the problem is with certificated components in experimental aircraft. For example, the vast majority of breakdown assistance calls are calls about engine issues. And the engines in these airplanes, to a large extent, particularly if they're RVs and stuff, are certificated engines. So we have no problem with that. The reason we have problems with experimentals is because we don't have we can't get a maintenance manual and look it up. There isn't one. So we do work actually with quite a few RVs. When you get to the more exotic experimentals, it becomes increasingly difficult for us to provide service for them because we just don't have access to the maintenance documentation that you would need.
Yeah, and I think that the same goes. There's been a couple questions about, how about for coverage outside of the U.S. or coverage for Alaska or Canada. And our general approach has been we only want to offer coverage and service where we can offer really good service. So it's not necessarily an arbitrary line we're drawing somewhere, but we want to offer service where we know we can offer good service. So I'd say for those folks who have particular questions, feel free to drop me a line. My email's there on the screen, zimmerman@sportys.com, and we can look at particular situations. As Mike said, an RV 12 with a pretty standard setup is one thing. An exotic one-off airplane that's based in northern Canada, we'd love to say yes to that, but probably just can't commit to delivering the service that you would expect from it. One last question, Mike, as we wind down here, and again, a lot of questions here on kind of this legal side, so don't mean to focus on that too much, but that's where a lot of the questions are. And this has to do with insurance, and this gets to kind of your broader point about your philosophy of maintenance, and it's okay to defer maintenance sometimes. Are there insurance considerations there? Does your insurer not like it if you're flying an airplane that has known squawks or has deferred maintenance or anything like that? Is there anything you should be aware of, or questions you should ask, or paperwork you should keep in order when you're thinking about a subject like insurance?
I've had a lot of very long talks with a number of very high-ranking aviation insurance underwriters about various things like that, and notably, for instance, the issue of operating engines and propellers past TBO. I think I have been quoted as saying in the past that I have more hours in my airplane over TBO than I have under TBO, which is a dubious distinction. But in any case, the basic answer to the question is, first of all, there are no insurance policies, at least in the United States, and I'll put a caveat on that because I actually have seen some issues with some policies like down in Australia, which are written a little differently than what we're used to here. But at least in the U.S., there's no there's no such thing as an insurance policy that has TBO limitations or any sort of airworthiness requirement beyond the FAA's airworthiness requirement. The basic requirement of most insurance policies is simply that the airplane has to be airworthy and the pilot has to be airworthy. And by that, they mean airworthy the way the FAA means airworthy. There's no insurance company that has its own private set of airworthiness standards. They all use the FAA's airworthiness standards. So, for instance, for a Part 91 airplane, the FAA says the airplane has to have an annual inspection once a year. So if you fly the airplane out of annual, you will not be covered. Your insurance won't cover you. Similarly, it says that you have to have a third-class medical, and if you fly the airplane and you have an expired medical, you may not be covered. Although in many states, you would still be covered unless the insurance company could show that the airplane accident in some way was caused by a medical issue. But there's no case where an insurance company requires some kind of airworthiness standard that is different than the FAA standard. So if the airplane is FAA legal, you're covered. Now there's actually a different part of that question, which is, okay, I'm covered, but what happens when it's time to come up for renewal? And that's a harder question to answer because insurance companies can have very arbitrary guidelines as to what risks they want to take on and what risks they don't want to take on. There's some insurance companies that don't like to insure twins. There are some insurance companies that don't like to insure senior citizens like me, and they don't have to. I mean, they can do anything they want when it comes to deciding whether they want to take you on as a client or renew you. Having said that, my airplane has been insured over the years by a number of the major underwriters, and most of the time that I renew my policy, I report the time on the engines, which is way over TBO, and I've never had an insurance company not renew me because the engines are over TBO. So, but they could if they wanted to. Insurance companies can do anything they want to with regard to deciding whether to renew you. But once you have insurance, they can't deny you coverage as long as you meet the FAA qualifications, both for the airplane and the pilot.
Great. Thanks, Mike, for the answer to that and for the whole webinar. Really, really informative. I think a lot of honest advice for owners out there. Again, for folks who want to learn more, sportys.com/BAP for Breakdown Assistance Program, or savvybreakdown.com, more information there on this specific Breakdown Assistance Program and how to sign up. Our email addresses are there as well. We thank you for attending tonight, and again, a recording of this will be available in the next couple of days at sportys.com/webinars. With that, we thank you for joining us and hope to see you again on another Sportys webinar.
Thank you, everybody.